Support for this podcast comes from the Bushwick Book Club, Seattle, staging a monthly evening of original music inspired by literature since 2010. For upcoming shows or more information, please visit thebushwickbookclubseattle.com. Hello, this is Tom Norum, and you're listening to Stories to Write Songs About, a podcast that features a story and an original song inspired by it. This week, I have invited a poet named Afrose Ahmed to talk about her experience with grief and the background of an incredible poem she has written called Season's Grievings. It can be a foreign and frightening concept, grief. One that we're conditioned to avoid and evade because its roots are in the death of something or someone that we love. My first experience with death was with my grandfather. He died when I was in the 7th grade, and at the time I didn't feel sad or distraught because for my entire life he was sick and ailing. So, when he finally passed, it was after a long and arduous journey to the end. It was a relief, to be honest, and I am sure for him he was ready to move on and leave this world. For me, it was a comfort knowing that he wouldn't be suffering anymore. But it wasn't until later in life that I began to miss my grandfather, or rather, I missed what I didn't experience with him. You see, when I went to college, I began to meet so many new people, and I realized that not everyone had sick grandparents. And some of my friends had thriving, active relationships with them. It was a harsh, eye-opening realization that I could have had experiences like that had I not been born the youngest grandchild on both sides of my family. And only then did I actually experience grief from the loss of my grandfather. I should say, however, that grief is not specifically tied to the loss of human life. It can appear in so many places and experiences. The failed dreams you couldn't accomplish, seeing your childhood home torn down, the falling out of relationships, or the never-ending destruction of our precious wild places. Grief creeps in every corner of our lives, and if we aren't prepared, it can catch us off guard. Now, I'm not saying that we should live our lives with tinfoil hats or doom and gloom philosophy. Just that we should not be so naive with what could come around the corner. Grief shouldn't be feared. It should be tackled head-on and wrestled to the ground. It should give us scrapes and kick us and leave us breathless, begging for a break. It should sink into the deepest parts of our soul and attach itself to our hearts. We should live unafraid of its anger or sadness or crippling depression. We should use it as a talisman for growth and healing. And we should move forward with it proudly hanging on our backs. My guest today is a poet. She is a hybrid Texas-Washingtonian who writes poems on Emerald City streets and at the top of evergreen trees. She is the daughter of Muslim immigrants from India and has a deep appreciation and love for her culture. She comes to poetry as just one avenue for creating experiences of beauty and communion for herself and other people. Her writing emphasizes all the senses and acknowledges a world in which humans are suffering and experiencing bliss against the wild landscapes that are simultaneously living and dying. She holds an MA in Asian Studies from the University of Texas and was a 2017 Artist Trust Gap Grant recipient, as well as a 2017 Jack Straw writer. I have asked her to be on the show to discuss the origins of her piece, Season's Grievings. Hello, Afrose. Please introduce yourself.
Hello, my name is Afrose Fatima Ahmed.
And Afrose, where did you grow up?
I was born in Fort Worth, Texas, but we moved to Eastern Washington, to Tri-Cities, when I was about 5 or 6 years old. And so I grew up in Kennewick, Washington.
Oh, wow. And that's where you spent, what age did you move?
I left when I went to college. So around 18, I went to Western and Fairhaven College in Bellingham, spent a couple years in Seattle. After that, then went back to Texas for about 4 years. I went to grad school in Austin, lived in Houston for a couple of years, and then came back to Washington. I've been in Washington for the last, 5 or so years. So I kind of consider myself a Texan-Washingtonian hybrid. But yeah, in Washington State, I've lived in Port Townsend and kind of all over the state. Yeah.
Very cool. And what did you study in your degrees?
In undergrad, I went to Fairhaven, which is kind of like Evergreen, and put together my own major, which was basically like the Middle East and South Asia area studies. So a lot of political science, economics, culture, stuff like that. And I got the opportunity to spend a year in the Middle East through a grant that I got from Fairhaven. And then for grad school, I was studying Urdu language, which is considered the language of Muslims in India and Pakistan. It's the language my family speaks. And I was more specifically translating poetry from Urdu to English, and also kind of rooting it in a historical, political, cultural context. So I think, I've always been a writer, and I've been writing poetry since I was a little kid. But it kind of took me a while to make creative writing and being a poet my main thing. And I think going to grad school to translate poetry was almost a little bit of it was like a transition into saying, this is what I can do full time, and make a living at it. So, yeah.
To pursue something in any creative field, there's kind of, you have to jump off the cliff, so to speak. Was that something that you were always a little hesitant about, or was it not even on your radar? Was it like, I just kind of enjoy this, but I never even thought about it?
It wasn't really on my radar. I mean, I think later in college, I started to take it a little more seriously. That year in the Middle East was really good for me because I had an opportunity to focus on my writing. And that's when I first encountered the artist's way, which I know has been really formative for a lot of artists. And so when I came back, I started taking poetry classes for the first time. But I just, throughout the years, I both from the family that I have, and then I was very heavily involved in political organizing. It always felt like there were more, quote unquote, important things to be doing with my time. And it wasn't until about five years ago, when the events that Seasons Grievings is based on all kind of happened and came to a head. And I realized that, life is short. Even if you live to be 80, it's still going to be short. And there's no time to waste not doing the things that you love and are passionate about. So now I really have done a 180, and I feel like my writing is my gift to share with the world, and it's my responsibility to bring it into the world. And it doesn't feel like, I was almost taught to believe that it was frivolous or unimportant before. And I feel like it's so critical and necessary now, not just for me, but for the people that encounter it.
So you have experienced two deaths that have been very close in relation to you, your father and your sister. How old was your sister when she died?
She had just turned 35. Yeah, she was young.
And she's how much older than you?
6 years older than
6
me.
years older than you. Wow.
Yeah, so I was just shy of my 29th birthday.
Oh my gosh.
It came as a surprise to us. I had actually just moved to Istanbul for a job, and I'd been in Turkey for like 3 weeks when I got a phone call from my brother, and I just had to throw some things into a bag and rush to the airport. And yeah, it was totally even after all this time and all this writing about it, it's hard to sometimes describe what that experience was to me. But I felt very much completely cracked open. I think that we think that we will spend our entire lives with our siblings. we've known them since birth, and they're our contemporaries. And I don't think that most of us, I certainly didn't expect to lose a sibling. Like, I really believe that we would grow old together, and we were all very close, and really similar in terms of our values and beliefs. And my siblings were some of my best friends, and so that loss really just did feel like losing a hand, losing like one of the things that helps me engage with the world. And I really did kind of, for better or worse, like snap a little bit, and just really kind of like the way that I embodied grief in the beginning was that I would just wanted to experience everything. And everything that I'd wanted to do that I'd been putting off or didn't have the courage to do before, I was going to do it. So I started dancing, taking dance classes. I started rock climbing. That was something I'd always wanted to do, but been kind of intimidated by. And I started just writing a ton, and self-published my first chapbook within, 6 months of her passing. I took a lot of older writings that I had and put together something, because it felt really important at that time to create. It felt urgent, I was very much living with the sense of my own mortality. And, it was a beautiful and exquisitely painful experience.
Experiencing a premature death in a family is a traumatic experience for anybody. How did your family react to this as a unit? Because your experience of the grief was an explosion of creativity and activity. How did your other family members deal with this intense amount of grief?
Yeah, it's been really hard for my mom. I don't, losing a sibling is one thing. I think losing a child, I think is just devastating and heartbreaking. And I guess it happens more than you would think. I feel like now I walk around the world and I do meet people who've lost children. It feels like with some frequency, but maybe it's just because I'm also putting it out there, and then those conversations are happening. But yeah, I think it's been tragic, really. I mean, I don't think that's an overstatement at all, especially for my mother. And then in terms of us as a unit, I think there are ways in which it's drawn us closer together. And there are ways in which it's created a lot of challenges for us, because I think that, all the work I've done around grief, in the years since then, I've really learned that grief needs to be witnessed. And yet, in order to sort of move through us and for us to heal, and yet it's so deeply personal and vulnerable to express our grief. And as a society, we are just not equipped. We are not trained. We are not taught to know how to hold other people's grief. And I know that that was true for me before I experienced the passing of family members. And I think that's one of the things that I feel really comfortable being vulnerable about is my grief. And I think every time that I've read Season's Grievings to a crowd at a poetry reading or whatever, at least one person is crying, usually more. It's just something that everybody is experiencing in one way or another. You may not have lost somebody close to you in death, but you may have lost a relationship that was really important to you. Or, there's a saying that like, we also need to grieve the things that we deserve to get that we never got. Most of us don't get everything that we deserve and need as children. Or we deserve to grieve the dreams that we have that we will never be able to accomplish. And I think especially in this world of, racism, capitalism, where lots of people are disenfranchised and can only focus on survival, so many of us have dreams that we must grieve because they're just not possible for us in this world. So I think that's the power of Seasons Grievings to me is, I spent a few years really writing about the particulars of losing my sister, the way that I lost her, what was left for me. A lot of that is in my first chapbook. But suddenly one day I sat down to write. I didn't know what I was going to write. I usually just sit and write stream of consciousness for an hour every morning. And Seasons Grievings just kind of popped up out of nowhere almost. It wasn't planned. It just happened. And it pretty much popped out in its complete form. I did some edits and whatever afterwards, and I really looked at it to edit it and was just like, no, I think it's complete, So it was definitely one of those moments where I know a lot of other writers and artists talk about just feeling like, Naomi Shihab Nye, she's a poet, and she did a podcast with Krista Tippett, the On Being podcast, and she talks about her most famous poem. She talks about feeling like she was just a scribe, like somebody, she heard the words being spoken to her and she was just writing them down. And for me, Seasons Grievings was one of those experiences, and it's really rare. I'll say that I probably experienced that. I mean, it's not often. It's maybe once a year. It's after in 365 writing sessions, one of them might feel like I'm tapping some deeper well that's there and available to all of us if we can access it.
Had you written Seasons Grievings before or after your father's passing?
It was after. Yeah, it was definitely, I just wrote it not even 2 years ago. And so that was, my father passed in 2010. Yeah, 2010. My sister passed in 2013. And then
so your father passed first and then your sister. Yeah. Oh my gosh. Yeah. So, and pretty, it's pretty, in the grand scheme of things, pretty closely together. It's a little bit difficult to believe that this summer it will have been 5 years since my sister passed. And a big thing that's on my mind is this day, which will be at the end of September in 2019, when I'm going to be older than she ever was. And that has really been on my mind. What do you do when you become older than your older sibling? And just to be that age and to be aware that I've reached the point where that was her whole life, not that we can sort of compare the quality and, what experiences she encapsulated, because she really did live richly. But I've been thinking about that for a long time, for years, and it feels like it's coming, that moment where I'm older than her. Is there anything else that you want to say specifically about Seasons Grievings before we get to the poem itself?
I do. I guess I'll just say that I have made chapbooks, so small poetry books. They're handmade. I made them myself and binded them and everything, of Seasons Grievings. And so those are available if anybody, really connects with the poem, you want to get in touch with me. please do, because I have that, and I find that they've, people have given them as gifts to people who are grieving, and yeah, so I'll just put that out there. But I think that Seasons Grieving, since I wrote it almost 2 years ago, it's still my favorite of my own writing. It hasn't lost its resonance or luster for me. And I think, I don't know how this goes for you, but for me as an artist, like, I have these experiences of, like, I'll be really in love with something I just wrote, and then, like, kind of vacillate over to sort of hating it, and then reach some kind of happy medium. But I just have always loved Seasons Grievings and haven't stopped loving it. So yeah.
Well, Afrose, thank you so much for chatting with me about this poem, and thank you for being on this podcast. It was a lot of fun to talk to you. Thank you.
Hey, thank you for doing this project. It's so exciting.
You can find more information about the work that Afrose does through her website. The links are in the description and also at storiesToWriteSongsAbout.com. I have a friend of mine to read Afrose's poem, Seasons Grievings. Please welcome Amanda Keogh.
Your grief is not a muddy puddle. You cannot jump over it. Your grief is not a riptide. It will not pull you under. Your grief is not a stepchild. You may not forget her. Your grief is not a challenge or a quest or even a compass. Your grief is the layer of leaves coating the forest floor, constantly underfoot, cracking with the pressure exerted by your souls, wanting to become one with the earth again. Your grief has a life cycle. It is incubated, it is born, it grows and learns to speak and seems to have a mind belonging only to it. It doesn't care whether you are tired or meeting a deadline or falling in love. When it is hungry, you must feed it. What does your grief like to eat? It craves remembrance. Take your grief to the last body of water you sat by with your dead beloved and cry, cry, cry. Repeat her name repeatedly. Chant it to the rhythm of your own heartbeat. Drop the pitch so low and speed up the rate so much until her name is the buzzing of 100 hives of angry bees, despairing at the death of the mortal world. Your grief loves to eat dance, too. The dance of words in a poem. The dance of emotional striptease. Slowly, with aching desire, peeling a glove of concealment or a feather boa of misdirection from the very plain, very honest animal body of the soul. And of course, the dance of the body itself, when it is cloaked only in your grief and lies on the honey wood floor of the dance studio, weeping and yet still moving, still rolling and arcing and feeling the varied threads of the music holding you together. Your grief is a crying baby, a starving child. When it is not fed, the world cannot roll along easily in its orbit. You can try to ignore it, try to turn the volume up on the dance hits that advocate for forgetting, try to kiss pale eyes goodnight and close them to seeing. But your grief wants you to collect those leaves from the forest floor, wants you to daily turn the compost bin with a pitchfork, mixed with the watermelon rinds and tea bags and coffee grounds, wants you to know what season in your life it is, so that you don't get fed up trying to grow wildflowers in an impoverished earth.
This week's song is entitled Season of Grief. It was a solo venture from beginning to end. I wrote, recorded, mixed, and mastered this track. It features me on every instrument and vocals. Please enjoy.
I am flying high above the earth today, just to see you one last time. Though I'll never hear you say my name again, I'll repeat yours till I die. And the tears come like a rainstorm, pouring memories out across the floor. And it feels like I am dying. Let it come like the flood, moving swift across the plains. This is my season of grief. Never felt a loss so deep within my soul. My heart is cracked beyond repair, and I will bleed from it the love I owe to you, for the pain's too much to bear. And I hear our mother crying, as my shoulders shake and tremble disbelief. And it feels like we are dying. Let it come like the wind, blowing swiftly through the trees. This is our season of grief. So I've learned to bravely give beyond myself, seek the fullness of life. And as I live beyond the age you left this earth, I'll pour my grief into the ground, and it grows into a garden. I will harvest beauty from this bitter pain. And it feels like I am thriving. Let it come like the rain, bringing beauty from the pain. This is my season of grief. Let it come like the rain, growing flowers on your grave. This is my season of grief.
Well, that's it for this episode. Special thanks to Afrose Fatima Ahmed for sharing her story, and to Amanda Keogh for the fantastic reading of Season's Grievings. Theme music by Lowlands and original music by Tom Roram. You can find more information about all of this at our website. Stories to Write Songs About is brought to you by Charlie Brown Productions. Oh, good grief. That's all I got for now. See you next time.